I see lots of familiar faces here. So today, I'm not sure how far we're gonna get, but today I want to talk about the remarkable things that are happening in Connecticut after about 1820 or so. And I'm going to, there's an idea in history, it's called American exceptionalism. And the idea is that somehow what was happening in this country, the people in this country, the institutions we developed, the political and social and ideas that we had were somehow different or better than anything that had existed in the past. We see this with the Puritans. The Puritans believed they were creating what John Winthrop called a New Jerusalem and his city on the hill sermon that he preached. The idea that somehow we were creating something that had never existed before. And this, throughout the 19th century, this was an idea that most people subscribed to. Certainly Abraham Lincoln did. On more than one occasion he talked about America being the world's last best hope. And in the Gettysburg Address, we all know the Gettysburg Address? Had to memorize it in 4th grade. I was going through it in my head today and I don't remember a lot of it. So he talks about the idea that you know, he says 77 years ago our fathers brought forth a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So he's talking about American exceptionalism there. And at the end of the speech, he says, you know, if we carry on, then we're going to, the American Republic will survive, right? So in the modern world, there's some people that don't buy the concept of exceptionalism. They think there's hubris or elitism, and I'm not going to argue one side or the other. I'm here to talk to you about Connecticut exceptionalism. Right? And not because we're better than anyone else, but because I think if you look at what's happening, at least in 19th century Connecticut, we always seem to be dominating in some areas. So, so that's my intro there. Okay, so Connecticut in 1820, this is a nice little pastoral image of a Connecticut farm, would you think? Yeah, that's actually a farm somewhere in Nebraska, I think, but I liked it. I liked the greenery, so. We have about 275,000 people. We have a real homogeneous society. About 95% Protestant. A significant percentage of the Protestants are Congregational and or Presbyterian, descendants of that old Puritan class of settlers. So we're talking about people of largely English heritage, and most people live on farms. So we're a rural Protestant society. And that's going to change pretty dramatically. By 1920, everything's different. Now, one of the things I'd like to say is that if you go back to, if you start in 1783, when we finally achieve our independence, we're the 3rd smallest state, right? And today, with 50 states, we're still the 3rd smallest state, right? So, which is, I find that interesting given as much history as you can really connect to Connecticut. So, all right, so by 1900, this is my image of, this is a nice horse-drawn trolley, right? I think this is somewhere in Georgia, but I think it could be a scene from Connecticut. So we're going to see a vast demographic change. We see immigration coming in. We see lots of the immigrants are going to be Catholic, which is going to cause all sorts of tension and disruption for a while. So the population is going to shift. We're going to see people moving out, people moving in. We're going to see people moving from the farms into mill villages and especially into cities, right? As a result of industrialization, we're going to see a growing middle class. We always think of industrialization as sort of the blue collar end of it. We think about the people that worked in the mills or worked in the factories. But as industrialization grows, what you have is a need for middle managers, and that sort of middle class, white collar segment of society is going to evolve over time. And the middle class is going to produce a lot of social changes, because when people start to get comfortable in the middle class, then they start to look around at what's going on around them, and that's where we get people interested in reform and social change. We say, if you're hungry, or if you're struggling to survive, you don't really care if your neighbor's hungry or struggling to survive, right? When you reach a point where you're reasonably comfortable in life, and then you can look around and realize that there are people that don't have as much as you, I think that's when people start to become generous because they can be, right? All right, so we also see an improved standard of living. Industrialization is going to mean that you can buy a lot of the things that you used to have to produce for yourself, right? So if you look at 1820, probably a lot of the clothes you're wearing were made by you or some person in your family, including your shoes. 1820, if you have bread, it's probably because mom got up about 4 o'clock in the morning and made it. In 1820, if you have vegetables, it's probably because you were growing them in the backyard. Most of what you have is stuff that you produced yourself, and that's very labor intensive. By 1900, you're buying things that are in tin cans. You can buy store-bought bread. You can buy clothing, especially shoes and things like that. So the standard of living increases pretty dramatically. And we also have a lot of new social ideas which are going to relate to the growing middle class. All right. So let's look at politics. And this is a nice little rural scene here. All right, the Constitution of 1818 broke the control of the sort of Congregationalist/Federalist Party. The Connecticut had been governed for a very long time by a group we call the Standing Order. Standing Order they were people, they were big names in the church. They were generally either ministers or lawyers, merchants. They had economic status, they had political power, they had social status, which is kind of, if you look at any society throughout history, the people at the top always have those things, right? So the Constitution of 1818, it disestablished the Congregational Church. So it meant that you didn't have to pay your taxes to support the congregational ministers. So we're going to see evolution of two political parties, but through at least 1850, there's very little difference between the political parties, because other than sort of a few minor social and political ideas, we're all just sort of those stiff-necked Yankee farmers that don't like change, right? You all know stiff-necked Yankee farmers that don't like, my grandfather was, he was a swamp Yankee, Oh yeah, in 1818 we had at the end of the Revolution, all the other states had charters that had been issued by the king. And because we told the king to go take a hike, all the states wrote new constitutions. We didn't. We kept the Constitution, we kept the charter we had from 1662, and it's not until 1818. And the reason that it gets rewritten is that the Federalists get defeated in the election of 1817, and we get a Jeffersonian Democrat, right? Okay, so now the odd thing is that all communities in state representation had one or two representatives. Now this is going to be okay. It's going to mean that the farm towns are dominant because most people live in rural communities. Now one of the things that's going to happen in the 19th century is going to see the growth of cities. In 1820, I think there's only 3 Connecticut cities that have more than 5,000 people, and they only have about 5,000 people. So if you look at the cities who have maybe about 5,000 people, there are a lot of rural communities that have 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 people. So it's pretty evenly divided. By the time you get to 1920, you have the population of Hartford and Bridgeport and New Haven and Middletown. They all peak back in 1920. If you look at the population, you might think that the population of Hartford today is higher than it was 100 years ago, but it was actually because of industrialization. It actually peaked in 1920, and it's actually been dropping off. So by the time you get to 1920, what you have is a significant percentage of people living in the cities, and yet the cities only have 2 votes in the state legislature, where a lot of the communities have at least 1, if not 2. So you're going to get this continued dominance of the rural communities. All right. So only Hartford, New Haven, and Middletown had more than 5,000 people in them. So we don't have, cities back then were not the sort of metropolitan centers that we think of today. All right, in the Senate, we have 8 counties, and 4 of the rural counties which are the northern counties there, not counting Hartford, so it's Litchfield and Windham and Tolland and New Haven. They control 5 of the 12 seats in the Senate, which means that the 4 urban counties only have 7. So essentially what that means is each county, 3 of the counties have 2 representatives and 1 only has 1. But they rotate every year. So this year New Haven has 2, and the next year New Haven has 2, and the next year New Haven has 2, and then in the 4th year they only have 1. All right. So what this means is that even in the Senate, which you have that the rural counties, they consistently have a fair amount of political power. So, and as population is shifting out of or to the cities, rural dominance increases. So it's not till the Constitution of 1965 that changes, right? All right. So we have outward migration. This is a very famous painting. It was done in about the 1880s, if I remember correctly. People are moving out because there's more and better land. By the time we get to the Revolution, most of the good farmland in Connecticut's taken, right? And yet in a farm society, your workforce is your children, right? So people are having 6, 8, 10, maybe 12 children because you want those people to work your land. And as long as in the colonial era there's unsettled land, your children can always move to a new community and get themselves some farmland. By the time we get to the 1780s, there's not a lot of good farmland left. So people start moving out. So what that's going to mean is that our population is going to continue to grow, but not as dramatically. In the 50 or so years before the Revolution, the population quadruples. In the next 50 years, it only goes up by about 50%. So, but it's not that the birth rate's going down as much as just more people are moving out. So people are moving out to places like Vermont, upstate New York, in the Trans-Appalachian West, into what we would call the Northwest Territories. I think this is really interesting. A historian went back and studied it, and in 1831 he looked at where the people in the federal Senate and the federal House of Representatives were born. And at this time when Connecticut, our population probably then was about 5% of the national total, he determined that 1/3 of all the people serving the Senate had been born in Connecticut, and 1/4 of the people serving in the House of Representatives had born in Connecticut, which I think says that we're on the forefront of moving out and settling and establishing, really taking our institutions with us, our churches and our schooling and our beliefs, right? Yes?
As far as the outward migration, they didn't move to Massachusetts or Maine?
No.
Because it was already filled up?
Or, yeah, pretty much, yeah. But that would be bad if I knocked that over, wouldn't it? Vermont was largely unsettled. Vermont, the people in New York thought it should be New York. The people in New Hampshire thought it should be New Hampshire. The people in New Hampshire call it the Hampshire Grants, and we called it New Connecticut. So lots of people. Ethan Allen's probably the most famous Connecticut person that moves north. At any rate, so this painting is supposed to show, let's see, I think I have the name of it there, do I? Okay, yeah. This is the concept of manifest destiny, have we heard this? Yeah, that's the idea that we're supposed to fill up the continent, right? Oh, I don't have the title there, okay. This painting is called American Progress, but most historians think it shows manifest destiny. So here's the East Coast, which is settled. This is, I think, supposed to be New York. And here we see trains coming across here, and then we have stages and wagon trains. Here's a Pony Express rider. Here are the Native Americans who are on the losing side, so they're sort of, they're being forced back, right? We can see here's some farmers coming west here. Here's some miners. There's some buffalo herds up here. Here are the Rocky Mountains. And so it's sort of a condensed view of manifest destiny, right? Obviously, the person that painted this believed in American exceptionalism. And the way I know about when this is made is you can see this is the Brooklyn Bridge here, which was not started until 1868 and opened in, 1883 or 84. So, but at any rate, I think that it's a real nice condensed look at the belief that many Americans had that we're supposed to be doing this. This is our God-given destiny, right? All right, then we have people moving in, and here we have, again, the Statue of Liberty is what, 1884, 1885, somewhere in there. So we have the immigrant experience, right? These people, they're probably coming, well, they might be going to Castle Garden, but let's say they're going into Ellis Island, right? So most of the people in Connecticut in the 1820s were descended from that great Puritan migration when about 20,000 people left England. Most of them went to Massachusetts Bay, and a couple thousand of them drifted into Connecticut, right? The next wave of migration we're going to see, by the 1820s, we see the Irish moving in. If we look at the early canals and early railroads in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, there's lots of Irish laborers, so you have people coming here for the jobs. The Irish faced a great deal of discrimination because they were the first Catholics. And back at that time, there was a great deal of hatred and distrust between the Catholics and the Protestants. Most Protestants thought that the Catholics took orders from the Pope, and they thought that was a dangerous thing. By the 1840s, we're seeing another round of Irish immigration, largely due to the potato famine. Right, 1847, the potato crop essentially failed. About 1 million people starved to death. Another 1 million or so came to this country. We also see German migrants coming in, and this is largely because of the failed revolutions in the 1840s. So we see, by the Civil War, about a third of the people living in Hartford are Irish. So there's a significant percentage. The Germans are, now it's interesting because the Irish speak English, the Germans don't. The Germans are generally more accepted. Number one, because they're Protestants, and number two, because they tend to be more skilled laborers, where the Irish tend just to be farmers. All right, and then we know after the Civil War, we see lots of people coming in from Eastern and Southern Europe, which is why, the federal government's going to take over handling immigration in the 1890s and open all of the stations like Ellis Island and Angel Island and that sort of thing. So we see this extreme shift, and what we see, other than the Germans, we see an awful lot of people that either Catholic or Jewish, right? So by the time we get to 1900, our little sort of Protestant island here is changing pretty dramatically. All right. In 1902, we tried to have a constitutional convention to change the way that representation was distributed. It failed, but here we have a little, they planted a tree in its honor. I think this, where is this? Is this in, I want to say it's down around Danbury or New Milford. Anyway. Essentially what happened is that there were a lot of communities where their population was increasing over 5,000 and they still only had one representative. So the idea there are some communities might have 500 people and they get one representative, and then you get a community like Farmington that has about 6,000 people and they only get one representative. And the whole idea that we had in a bicameral legislature is that the House should represent the people, right? So in 1874, we amended our Constitution. So we said any community, if they get more than 5,000 people, they'll get at least 2 representatives. In 1875, they passed another law that said new towns can't be represented till they get 2,500. So they're trying to slowly kind of adjust it. One of the reasons they're reluctant to do this is a lot of the immigrants are moving into the cities. And because a lot of people dislike the immigrants, they felt like if you started to give the city too much representation, then the power would shift out of the sort of the rural Protestant farm communities, right? So anyway, in 1902, there's an attempt to rewrite the Constitution, and that fails dramatically. So it's 1965 before we get a new Constitution, right? And in 1965, the new Constitution, it does a couple of things. The most important is reapportionment. Some of you were probably alive in 1965, right? A few of us, yeah, okay. All right, and then the other thing that's going to happen during this time period is the state capitol. We've all been to the state capitol, haven't we? Yeah, it's Gothic, right? We know it's Gothic because it has pointed arches. I have an argument with my wife. She thinks it's lovely. I think it's just less than lovely. So up to this point, Hartford and New Haven had been co-capitals. Originally, New Haven was a separate colony. When the Charter of 1662 had joined New Haven and Hartford, or New Haven to the Connecticut colony, the people in Connecticut, people in New Haven were really upset. And one of the ways we mollified them is we said, okay, we'll take turns. You can be the capital half the time. So one year the legislature would meet in Hartford, and one year they'd meet in New Haven, and they went back and forth. Initially, they met in taverns. And sooner or later, they were actually state houses built. We seen the old state house in Hartford? Yeah, there was a state house in New Haven as well. But by the 1870s, it's decided that we need to settle down. We need to pick one city. And the question is it going to be Hartford or New Haven? New Haven was larger. New Haven had more people. Hartford was centrally located. There was a big push in the 19th century to move capitals to the center of states. So if you look at the history, like Indianapolis wasn't always the capital of Indiana. If you look at Indiana, it's kind of like dead center. Columbus is dead center in Ohio. These were not the original capitals, but eventually they decided it just makes sense that you kind of put it in the middle. So the question is, who's going to get it? The city of Hartford promised $500,000 to build a state capitol if they were awarded that. They were awarded that, and they didn't have $500,000. So they had, well, what does the government always do? They sold bonds, right? They borrowed the money, right? All right. But there was actually a statewide vote, and you might think by now there's over 300,000 people. Only about 70,000 people voted, and Hartford won. I think the vote was 36,000 in favor and about 32,000 opposed. So the statewide vote, it's decided that the capital is going to move or be permanently established in Hartford. So the capital doesn't open right away, but as of 1875, all sessions are held in Hartford. So at this point, it is decided that Hartford is going to be the political center of Connecticut, and New Haven, because of Yale University, is going to be the intellectual or academic center, right? All right. And then the new capital doesn't open until 1879, and that's part of Bushnell Park, right? We know Bushnell Park, but the whole Capitol grounds is the hill in front and all that. That's part of the park. Now Trinity College used to be there, right where the Capitol is, and we essentially bought the land from Trinity. And the way you know that is that where the Capitol's sitting here, and here's the Bushnell, little side street there's Trinity Street, right? And that's I have a slide on Trinity coming up here. So, all right. So the whole idea of our state capital gets settled. All right. And then if we go back and we look at economic growth, I would say the biggest problem towards economic growth in the 19th century and probably anywhere is capitalization, raising the money, right? Today money's ridiculous, right? You can have more credit cards than you know what to do with. You can, it's very easy. In college campuses, they have people handing out credit card forms, like to sign up for credit cards. I remember the first credit card I signed up for, I had to give them a pint of blood and x-rays of my grandmother and but it's just credit. The credit system today is much, much different than it used to be. So in the 19th century, capitalization is going to be a real issue. Here's a lovely image of the Erie Canal, right? Could have been the Farmington Canal, but it was never that wide, right? All right. So early on, the way that they solved the problem of capitalization is through joint stock companies, which means that we want to build a road from here to Hartford. It's going to cost us $30,000. Not any one of us has $30,000, but we could each buy stock, and between all the people in this room, we could raise $30,000, and we could build the road, right? So that's essentially a joint stock company. That was an idea that dates back to at least the 12th century in England, and maybe even before that. Eventually, though, people start to make their own individual investments, and one of the easiest things to invest in is a merchantship. So let's suppose you're a local merchant here and you're trading goods with farmers and you're buying goods that are being imported, and eventually you get a few extra dollars. You can actually afford to invest in a ship or maybe buy one yourself, right? So merchant ships are a good way for people to earn money, and if you start making money here, then you're going to invest in other things, right? Banking's another place where people make a lot of money. Bank stock was considered one of the best investments you could make. Anytime there was a bank chartered here in Connecticut, the stock always sold really, really, really quickly. Unlike things like canal stock, which was harder to sell, right? One of the things people do as a specialty aspect of being a merchant is becoming a cotton broker. As the textile industry starts to grow here in Connecticut, you find that people realize that we need to have people that go south and buy the raw cotton and bring it up and sell it to the textiles. So there are a number of people here in Connecticut make small fortunes and even large fortunes as cotton brokers, right? And the other way you can make money is investing in a whaling ship. Back then it would cost you about $25,000 to outfit a whaling ship, and as the owner of the ship you draw somewhere between 12 and 15% of the profits. But what you're going to see over time is that people get involved in one area, they make money on ships, they're going to invest money in banking, they're going to then get invested in being cotton brokers, so you sort of see this snowball effect. So for example, if you look at, there are a number of people that made money in whaling or in banking, they are going to invest their profits in textile mills. And here in Connecticut, we had over, 200 textile mills by 1850. The other thing that money gets invested in is insurance companies. We know that about 1817, we see the first insurance companies here in Hartford. And a lot of the insurance money is coming from either whaling or from the cotton industry, right? We know J.P. Morgan. Well, J.P. Morgan banks today, but there was the original J.P. Morgan. His father was a merchant in Hartford, got involved and became a very powerful cotton broker. So by the time that Morgan comes along, he gets involved in banking, and then he gets involved in everything, right? He's one of those people. He buys railroads, he buys steamship companies, he buys steel mills, he buys anything he can make money on, right? And he's one of the reasons the New Haven Railroad went bankrupt, right? Because he oversold the stock and all of that. All right. So what's happening in the 19th century is we're shifting from what we call merchant capitalism to market capitalism. In merchant capitalism, if we have a little factory here in town, I'm probably the owner. And so the ownership is in one person's hands. I might have a partner, maybe my family is involved in it. I'm the manager, I make the decisions. The people that work for me, there's a small group of people. I know all of you. You all go to my church. You all are part of my community. So it's a very small enterprise. I'm probably getting my raw materials from right here in town. And my market is probably the people in town, and maybe I'm shipping stuff as far away as Hartford or New Haven, right? Market capitalism, we're going to see a complete shift here. With market capitalism, we don't have an individual owner, we see stock ownership, right? So we see, so ownership changes. In market capitalism, the manager is actually someone that's hired, right? So if we're the stockholders, it's not like one of us might be the manager, but we're probably going to find someone with a college degree that can come in and run our factories for us, right? Under market capitalism, we're going to be buying our raw materials from farther away. We're going to be shipping our goods farther away. So we see a complete shift from sort of that individual merchant capital approach to market capitalism. It's market capitalism in the 20th century. It's going to give us General Motors and IBM and all of General Electric, so and the growth. All right. We talked last time about mill villages a little bit, did we not? All right. So I'll just zip through. This is Whitneyville, right? We see lots of the river valleys. We see textile mills growing up because of the water power, the source, as a source of energy. Rivers are going to be important until we get to the 1870s and we start to see electricity, and suddenly we don't need to have a mill here in town because we can tap into the Farmington River. We can have a mill in Hartford, not located on the river, but because it's centrally located, it's easier to ship goods in and out of Hartford and that sort of thing. So anyway, so river valleys, we're going to see textile mills, especially in the Northwest. We see iron forges. I think we talked about those a little bit. So what happens over time is settlements become established. And previously, what we saw was while we have established communities like Simsbury, you then have lots of farm villages, right? So we start to get mill villages evolving, places like Whitneyville, and the name comes from, you take the name of the mill owner, or in this case it's Eli Whitney, and you put a ville on the end of it, and that's, so almost all of the mill villages have a ville of some sort. Did we talk about villas last time? Villas, Lafayette, General Lafayette. At 19, he's an aide-de-camp to Washington. He's a French aristocrat. He doesn't lose his head to the guillotine. Comes back in the 1820s on the 50th anniversary of the American Revolution, and he's feted everywhere. People just get so excited to see him, and there are speeches and dinners and all sorts of really cool things. And historians believe that we take the concept of ville from the idea of the French village, right? So it's because of this sort of French influence that we sort of adopt this idea of the village, right? So we have, Whitneyville and Forestville and Yalesville. All right. Now, in the mill village, what you have is the mill owner is going to build a school. It's going to build churches, stores, and houses, right? So, and if you come to any mill village, where were we the other day? I guess we were driving up into Winstead, and there were about 5 little houses, and they're all a little tiny, and they weren't in very good shape. And my wife looked at them and said, "Oh, those houses are terrible." And I said, "They're mill houses. They're probably 100 plus years old, and they were built for people that worked in the mill." She said, "Mill? Where was the mill?" My wife doesn't know history at all. I said, "You see the river?" I said, "You see that old brick building? That's the old mill, and that's where the people worked." So anyway. All right. By 1920, there were over 100 villes in Connecticut. Most of them still exist. I'm from one of them. I'm from Plainville, which was not a mill village, but it was named for a completely different reason. Okay. All right. One of the things that starts to happen here in Connecticut, and it's really happening here first, is ideas for reform. And I think it's interesting. You can see any place industry moves in, and you see the sort of growing middle class. You also see people seeking reform. And so as see, from your point of view, it goes this way. As industrialization moves from the east, as it moves west, what we see is the reform ideas do that as well. So one of the big reform ideas is anti-slavery and or abolitionism. Abolitionism and anti-slavery were really two different things. People that were anti-slavery, they thought that they didn't oppose slavery because they thought it was inhumane. They opposed it because they thought the American free enterprise system couldn't coexist with slavery. It's actually, if you look at a lot of Lincoln's speeches, that's what he's really arguing about. When the House divided speech, he says, America can't continue to be half slave and half free. He said, I don't know which way it's going to go, but it can't continue. A house divided against itself cannot stand, right? So the anti-slavery movement is very big here in Connecticut. There certainly Harriet Beecher Stowe is probably the best known, right? But there are any number. Henry Bowen is a big name. Lots of people, especially in Hartford, there was a whole group of people that opposed slavery. Also, by 1820, people are starting to be concerned for the less fortunate. And we'll get into that a little bit. There's also a big desire for education. Here in Connecticut, we've always had a very strong dedication to education. From, I think, the 1640s on, the level of literacy here in New England really has been one of the highest in the world. And that's because of the dedication to education, starting with the Puritans, who believed that everyone ought to know how to read and write, because they should be good citizens and they should be good Christians, right? All right. We also see a large push for women's rights coming from people here in Connecticut, and temperance. Now, if you were all 19 and this was a college classroom, I would ask, do we know what temperance is? And everyone would stare at me like, isn't that one of the characters on a TV show or something? Anti-alcohol, right? We all know the water wagon and okay. All right. All right, so care for the poor. Early on, what we always had here in Connecticut from the very beginning was a town system. This is actually a poor farm. I think it dates from about 1870 or so. But individual towns were responsible for the care of the poor, and especially poor children. So in the colonial era, if you had children that were going to school, you had to pay for the upkeep of the teacher. But if the family couldn't afford it, then the town would pay the children's percentage. So the town system meant that the poor were taken care of, but it also meant that you kept track of who was coming into town. Right? If a poorly dressed gentleman arrives in town and stops at the pub and is having lunch, someone's going to say, "Where are you from?" Because you know, he might have heard that here in Simsbury we treat the poor very well, and he might be not have a means of support. And if that proves to be the case, the local sheriff might say, "We don't like your kind around here, son, and you know, if you just keep walking, Granby's that way, and maybe they'll treat you better," right? So it within the community itself, there was a real sense of community, a real sense of responsibility. As far as outsiders went, we tended to be very suspicious because, let's face it, we don't like to pay our taxes to things that we don't know where the money's going, right? Or we didn't used to. All right. So the children especially are taken care of. So, for example, if there's a family here in town, let's suppose there's a family here in town, there's a fire or something, and the parents die and the children are orphaned, we here in the community we'd either find someone to adopt them. We might, if we knew there were relatives living someplace like New Haven or Boston, we might try to, you know, make an effort to find someone to take care of them. If not, we might, if there might be a local businessman who would take them in under the indentured system. So the, you know, when you're indentured, you're being fed and cared for, and you're being taught a trade. Doesn't mean you weren't misused, right, or abused. Some people who did not treat their indentured servants very well. But the idea is that we, within the community, we had a very strong sense of our responsibility to children, right? All right. And also one of the things we established were poor farms. Here's a good example. So if a person didn't have any land and had no place to go, you could go live on the poor farm. You were sleeping inside, and on the farm you could raise your own food, you could cut firewood, you could raise pigs or chickens and have a reasonably good lifestyle, right? This worked out well for some and not so well for others. Why is there a period? Oh, you know what? The period is at the end of the abbreviation there. All right, so let's pretend that period's up there. Someone didn't proofread this very well. Okay, and we also had what were called almshouses, which were kind of like poor farms, except they were in the cities, and they were places where if someone in Hartford was destitute, they could go live in an almshouse. These tended to be really underfunded, though. These are probably I was going to say Dickensian. Like something out of Dickens, yes, okay. Oliver Twist, I don't know if they were workhouses or not, but they tended to not be the best. But again, the idea is that from the beginning, we had this sense of personal responsibility to our neighbors, right? Oh, and the poor orphans are, okay, so that's a really terrible slide, isn't it? I have to talk to my typist, okay. All right. One of the areas that we lead in is the Connecticut Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb. This is the American School for the Deaf today, right, in West Hartford. I believe it's the first of its kind, or the second, right? Yeah, 1817, Thomas Gallaudet, who is, if you know anything about your history at all, this is a huge name, right? Gallaudet Hall is, well, there's here, but there's one at Central, there's one at UConn. He had studied in France, and he brought his ideas from France to America, and he opens a school, right? The state was rather ungenerous. They gave him $5,000, and they said, "Please go away and don't come back," which he didn't do. He kept asking for money, and every year the state would provide a little bit of money. But again, we have to think this is both political parties. They really want to keep the budget balanced. They don't want to spend any money they don't have to. So in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, I think parsimonious is a really good way to describe the legislators. Legislators, yes, okay. By 1828, He had taken in 15 children, and the state was actually paying him $200 each, which is about $3,000 a year, and they grumbled every single year when they had to pay it. But again, this is, I'm pretty sure we're the first. Oddly enough, the governor got to choose who was admitted. Now, I can tell you there were many more than 15 children there were probably several hundred. It's generous to a point, but it's really not. We also, we tried to establish services for the blind, and we didn't have much luck with that because the state was already shelling out a lot of money there. So essentially, we created a system where the state provided, I think it was about $5,000, but we were sending students to Massachusetts up to, there was a big school in Boston, which I think still exists. I think it's is it Perkins School for the Blind? I think that's it. Yeah, okay. All right, and then the Hartford Retreat is established. Do we know the Hartford Retreat? It's the Institute of Living today, right? And again, treatment for people with mental illness back then was pretty horrific. Have you seen The Miracle Worker? Yeah, you get little flashes of how awful conditions were. It was not much. Lots of retreats were really, they were prisons, and not very nice prisons. Is there such a thing as a nice prison? Probably not. So in 1824, the Hartford Retreat is established. The man in charge, his idea is to provide humane treatment. And by humane treatment, what's happening is he thinks the people, they should be well fed, they should be bathed regularly, they should have clean clothes, they should have the opportunity to exercise, they should have a nice place to go outside and get some fresh air. And none of those things had been offered to people with mental illness in the past, right? The problem is he only took paying patients, which meant if you had if your family was willing to pay to provide for your care, you were all set. But and the state was rather reluctant. 1866, we actually built there was a state asylum built, but the state asylum didn't. Well, I think they still exist today too. So, but anyway, the Hartford Retreat. It's have we been down there? It's on Retreat Avenue, right? Yeah, my parents actually met there. My mother was working there the summer before her senior year of college. She was an aide, and my father was working there as a lifeguard, and they met. They fell in love, and so I can tell people that my parents met in a mental institution, and they often say that explains a lot about me. So, anyway. Oh yes, the state was, when we opened the state asylum, we only provided $2,000 a year, which again, if you figure it's a couple $100 a piece, we're only taking care of a handful of people. So it's really, are we on the forefront of these ideas? Yes, we absolutely are. Are we gung-ho on it and really pitching in and doing what we ought to? No, but very often, unfortunately, in history, what you see is everything's incremental, right? So you have to be able to find the seeds and then figure out how they move forward, right? All right.
Was the state asylum in Hartford, or was it in Middletown?
I think Middletown. I think that's, yeah. Because I think that's the they're still there, yes. All right, and then prison reform. This is what prison used to look like. Well, not even prison, just local punishment, right? Today you couldn't do this, right? Because you're not allowed to embarrass someone when you're punishing them, right? But the punishments used to be public. The hangings were public, right? I was just reading an article in the Hartford Courant today about a girl that was hanged in the 1780s. And there were, 2,000 people came out to watch. It was sort of, which strikes me as sort of sad and grisly, but all right. So colonial prisons, they tended to be rather cruel. They weren't heated very often. And this goes back to England. If you had a family member that would support you and make sure you had food and things like that, you were lucky, and if not, then it was sort of catch as catch can. Very often they issued very harsh sentences. In Puritan New England, they had an idea that you were either for us or against us, right? You were either a good citizen and you weren't, and if you weren't a good citizen, they were going to do anything and everything to either get you to reform or at least let other people know that you weren't a good citizen. So one of the things they would do is brand you. right? So if you don't know who I am and I come walking up the street and I have a brand mark on my forehead, you know, oh, be careful of this guy, right? Another thing they would do is they would clip your ears, you know, split your ear. So again, it's a punishment, but it also lets the rest of the world know that you might be less than honest, right? And the other thing they did is they had a 3 strikes and you're out policy where repeat offenders, they would just execute you. They would say, you know what, this is the 3rd time we caught you stealing a loaf of bread. You're not getting it, so we're going to execute you. So, so at any rate, for a very long time, Newgate Prison, the copper mine was our prison. Have you ever been down there? I used to go there when I was a kid and climb down that ladder where half the rungs were missing, and I don't know why I didn't fall and kill myself, but yeah, oh yeah, yeah, and it, you know, it always struck me there's no place to sit down. You know, you either sit on the cold, hard stone, which was wet. You know, in the summertime it always felt too chilly. I can't imagine what it was like in the wintertime. And yet that was the prison, right? That's where, well, they stayed overnight at least. So in 1827, the state prison opens at Wethersfield. There were 200 cells. I believe this is the 2nd state prison in the country. I think Massachusetts was probably ahead of us on that one. So, and this is a real model. You know, people, the prisoners are kept indoors. It's reasonably well heated. The food isn't all that bad. One of the things you had to do though was work. Have you ever, if you've been up to the copper mine in, can you see the remains of they were making shoes. They had a big wheel. Instead of being powered by water, people would say you just walk on the wheel and you'd spin it. What's that?
Kept them warm.
Yeah, yeah. At any rate, if you were in the state prison, you had to work, and they would make things like shoes and they would sell them, and rather quickly the prison became profitable and it paid for itself for a very long time. Yes?
Didn't they make the license plates there for years?
Eventually, but we didn't start issuing state license plates till I think about 1924. Yeah, early on, and I used to have one, and I gave it away. I don't know why I did, but my grandfather, his first license plate, what you did is you made a license plate. He made one out of leather, and he put the numbers on it, and I think he paid the state, I don't know how much money for it, but yeah. So when they started to I think, do they still do that? I think they probably do, yeah, yeah. Now, whether we make a lot of money on that, I don't really know.
And street signs too.
What's that?
Street signs too.
Yeah. Furniture, okay, yeah. So, but at any rate, in the 19th century, this wasn't really costing a lot of money, which is why the state legislature, they were okay with that, because again, they were not into investing any money that they didn't absolutely have to. All right, then we get temperance. I love this cartoon. This is sort of the road to rack and ruin. You see, here's a young man, he has a drink, and then he starts hanging around with a questionable young woman, and then he gets involved with this guy who has a gun, and then he's smoking cigars and playing cards and not working, and then he sort of heads down the road to being a drunkard, right? And of course, what's happening here is his wife and child, they're suffering, right? The temperance movement, it's all about women. The early women's movement is in support of the temperance movement. Probably 90 to 95% of the people in the temperance union are women. And the reason for that is that if women had no legal rights or very few legal rights. So if a young woman has property and she gets married, her husband takes control of the property. And it was almost impossible to get a divorce, and when you did get a divorce, the man always got the property and the man always got the children. So if a young woman was married to a guy who went down the road to rack and ruin, her life was ruined, her children's lives were ruined, and she had no legal recourse, right? So we're going to see one of the early big pushes for reform is going to be in the area of alcohol. So this is linked very directly to the women's movement. In 1829 here in Connecticut, we formed the Connecticut Temperance Society. And again, I would guess that from the beginning, about 90% of all the people were women. I think this is maybe the second temperance society in the country. I think the first one was a couple years earlier in Massachusetts. Now, alcohol consumption back then was about 4 times what it is today. Well, there's a couple of reasons for that.
Water wasn't safe.
Water wasn't safe, sure. Well, the other thing is that a lot of people.
Cider was hard cider.
Say again?
And the thing is that for men particularly, after work, it's not like they had softball or bowling. I mean, they drank.
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But the other thing is, I don't know about you, but see, I get up in the morning, I take a couple of aspirin, and then I have allergy medication that I take. I have stuff for my blood pressure. I have stuff for my cholesterol. You know, every time I go to the doctor, he says, "Oh, you had another birthday." Well, people your age are more likely to get, and then fill in the blank because, you know, and I keep telling, well, people my age, sooner or later, they're likely to die, right? So, at any rate, there were no over-the-counter medications at all. Aspirin is patented in 1898. So essentially, what you see is a lot of older people, and you might know some older people. As you get older, you get aches and pains and what they used to call, rheumatism and arthritis and all of those things. And so it was not uncommon for an older person to have a hot toddy in the morning, a glass of wine partway through the day. When John Adams was in his 80s, I read a biography of him, and he'd get up in the morning and he'd have a gill of brandy before breakfast. He'd have a toddy after breakfast. He'd have wine with lunch. In the afternoon, he'd have a couple of what we call cocktails. He had wine with supper. And so he just had kind of a buzz going all day. And I'm assuming that by the time he was in his 80s, he had what we all have in terms of regular aches and pains. So to a certain extent, what's happening here is people are using it for medication of one sort or another. Now, the temperance movement is so successful that by the 1850s we see 2 things. The first thing that happens is the states actually start to regulate alcohol. They start to say you have to be a certain age to buy it. Not everybody can manufacture it, so you get regulation. But also because of the whole temperance movement, the consumption drops pretty dramatically. People start drinking coffee and tea. Why? Because of caffeine, right? All right. You all know these things, right? Again, I have to explain these things to 18-year-olds and say, when you get older, your body doesn't function the way it always used to, right? So temperance is going to lead to 2 things. Regulation. I think Maine is the first state in the 1830s to actually pass laws about who can sell alcohol and who can buy it. And it also leads to a tremendous reduction. But also, back then, people made their own, especially on people on the frontier, because there's not a lot of money. So if you're living on the frontier and you're raising wheat, at the end of the year, you want to convert your wheat into something that's valuable. So you could grind it up into flour, which has a shelf life of, well, let's see, flour that's 2 or 3 years old isn't very good, right? You can convert it to bread. Bread that's more than a couple weeks old isn't all that good, right? Or you can turn it into whiskey. Because whiskey that's 2 years old is really good, and when it's 5 years old, it's even better, right? The other thing is it's compact. So I might have a wagon full of grain, and I turn it into whiskey, and I might just have a couple of gallon jugs, right? So it's easier to store, it's easier to carry, and on the frontier, it's always, always, always used for barter. If we know the story of Abraham Lincoln, he's born in Kentucky, and when he's about 6, his father moves down the Ohio River and up into Indiana. And what he had done that year is he had raised wheat, and he had converted his wheat crop into about 40 or 50 jugs of whiskey. And so on the little flatboat, as they're sailing down the river, there's the family, he has an axe and a musket and a hoe, which all farmers needed, and he has all this whiskey lined up. And when he gets to Indiana, he uses the whiskey to buy some land and to pay his taxes and to buy barrels of sugar and flour and to get his family going. So it was a means of trade, and very popular too. Anyway. All right, women's rights. This is Isabella Beecher Hooker. You know the Beechers? Beechers were kind of like the 19th century Kennedys, right? The patriarch is Lyman Beecher. Lyman Beecher was he's actually a blacksmith. He was from Durham, I think. His uncle sent him to Yale College. He becomes a minister, and he has, about 13 or 14 kids. All of his sons become ministers, and they're all very well educated, and he has 4 daughters. 3 of them become quite famous, right? We have Harriet Beecher, who marries Calvin Stowe. She writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? Catherine Beecher, who was, she was more famous than Harriet for a very long time. Catherine Beecher started a school for young women in Hartford. She kind of invented what we would call home economics, which today they don't teach home economics in school. What do they teach? Family and consumer science or something like that. But yeah. So at any rate, and this is the youngest sister. This is Isabella Beecher. She marries into the Hartford Hooker family, and she is a great advocate for women's rights in the 19th century. So essentially, in 1820, the rights of women are extremely limited. Women are not allowed to vote. They're not allowed to own property, except under very certain circumstances. It's what they call the femme covert, which means the woman is hidden within the law. And the rights of a woman generally flows through a man. So when she's young, it's her father. If she gets married, it's her husband. If she doesn't get married, it becomes her brother, her uncle, or someone. So so the idea is not that she doesn't have rights, but she's not recognized by the law as a direct citizen. One of the first things that happens is in 1826 is the debtor laws are repealed. This saves women quite a bit, because if you're married to a guy who runs up debts and ends up in debtor's prison, then your family is destitute, right? So with the debtor's laws repealed, most people see this as the first step towards guaranteeing sort of the sanctity of the family and the guarantee that if you're married to a guy who is going to waste the family valuables, it doesn't condemn you and your children to a life of poverty, right? It was always stipulated women could inherit land and protect it if her husband deserted her. So if your husband doesn't desert you, he can do whatever he wants with your property, but if he takes off, you can claim control of it. So that is probably the one legal aspect here that worked. And then in 1844, the legislature passes the women's property law, which goes to the Senate and doesn't get passed for 6 more years. But as of 1850, women are allowed to own their own property. Men are not allowed to sort of take it. If a woman inherits property, if a woman goes into a marriage with property, a woman can buy property. So this is really, really, really big, because it's really one of the big steps towards women voting, which doesn't come until 1920, right? It's the same year that here in Connecticut we started letting women drive cars. So.
If she gets an inheritance, like from her father, and she's married, he gets the inheritance?
Yes. Yes.
She has nothing to say about it.
No. Well, because women didn't know they didn't know business. They weren't smart enough to manage their property or make decisions, so. Again, this exists in all agricultural societies. This goes way, way back to the beginning. And again, it's this idea that you see throughout most of Western history that the man, whether it's the father or the husband, is sort of the recognized citizen, the person that's making the economic decisions, making the political decisions, and has control of the family finances. So yeah.
Still the case in big parts of the world.
What's that?
I said it's still the case in big parts of the world.
Sad but true. Yeah, very sad. Okay. But again, this is the first state to pass property rights was New York. I think New York was 1848, and then Massachusetts is like 1854 or something. So what's happening here in Connecticut, it's happening in other New England states, and not really much outside of New England. And where it's happening out in Pennsylvania or Ohio, it's because lots of people from Connecticut are moving out there and taking their political ideas. Lyman Beecher is going to move his family out to Ohio in 1834, I think it is. And Harriet goes with him because she's in her early 20s. And that's where Harriet encounters slavery. She meets people that are involved in the Underground Railroad. She meets people that are slaves. She meets people that are slave owners. And she starts to collect all of these stories. Yeah, the Beechers get in a lot of trouble in Ohio because they're in Cincinnati, which is right on the river, and there's a lot of, but Lyman Beecher liked trouble. He was a real fiery guy. We could spend a whole session just talking about the Beechers. They're just infinitely interesting, I think. Okay. All right. All right, and we know the 19th Amendment in 1920 said you can't deny vote by reason of gender, right? They didn't say gender, they said sex, because today we would say gender, but back then when they meant gender, they said sex, right? Okay. Education, and again, we could probably spend a whole 4 episodes on education. Here in Connecticut, we always had a very strong commitment to education. The Code of 1650, if you remember, it said any community that has 50 families, you had to hire a schoolmaster. Now, if you have a schoolmaster, the schoolmaster is going to, you're not going to build a school, but the schoolmaster is going to live with all of the families that have children. And part of his care is going to be, he's going to be at my house for a week, and he's going to be at your house for a week, and so on, right? Generally speaking, over time, the schoolmaster figured out who was the best cook and who had the most comfortable lodgings. You know, if the schoolmaster has to sleep in a bed with like 9 kids, probably doesn't like that, but if the schoolmaster has his own room, so it's not hard and fast necessarily, but that's part of the support, and that's part of the way you pay for your children's education. When you get 100 families, you need a grammar school. Now, that doesn't mean you had to build a building. Most towns did, but a grammar school just means you have someone, the schoolmaster, well, everyone was supposed to know how to read and write. So when your child walks through the door at 5, I wasn't going to teach them their ABCs. You know, it was up to the parents to teach them how to read and write. This is sort of a basic education. The grammar school is going to be a little more advanced. I might actually be teaching Latin to some of the kids, some of the more advanced kids. Certainly, if you wanted to go to college, you had to know Greek and Latin, right? And usually, because you couldn't learn those in the smaller schools, you'd probably hire a tutor or go study with a town minister who knew Greek and Latin, right? All right, so anyway, in 1717, we passed a law that said any town that had more than one parish had to build a schoolhouse. Now, the parish would be the church community, right? In 1795, the Western Reserve, which was that land in Ohio, right, that we, if you remember, our Connecticut charter said that our western boundary wasn't New York, it was the South Sea, which they meant the Pacific Ocean, right? So Connecticut should be about, what, 70 miles high and about 3,000 miles long. We gave up our claim to land west of New York in return for, what was it, about 12 million acres in northern Ohio, that little strip. It's about 120 miles long and about, what, 20 miles high or so. Anyway, we sold most of that for $1.2 million and created the school fund, and the money was supposed to be reserved only for Connecticut education. Now, for a while, the money was monitored by Yale University, and there was usually the treasurer of Yale was also the person who monitored the investments in the school fund, but the money wasn't exclusively for the university. But at any rate, I think this shows that even early on, we have this very strong commitment to education. By 1798, what we're seeing in a lot of the communities is what we call school societies, and they're financed by property taxes. So rather than have, it's not like every community. Today we have free public education, right? Every town has schools. What's happening here is the communities that can afford it, they're starting school societies, they're raising taxes, and they're putting that towards schools. And that's not very popular, right? Because if you don't have kids, you're like, well, I care if we have schools, right? Yeah. One of my favorite posts somebody put up on Facebook is, I don't mind paying for schools even though I don't have any kids because I don't like living in a society where people are dumb, right? I think, yeah. All right. I don't like most of the stuff on Facebook, but I thought that was funny. Okay. All right. In 1821, this whole idea of tax support, it discontinues. And again, starting in the 1820s, the Connecticut legislature, they become so conservative that they don't want to spend money on anything, anytime, anywhere, for any reason whatsoever. So this is going to be an argument. It's going to go back and forth. Should our taxes be paying for our schools, right? In 1838, we get Henry Barnard. Henry Barnard is, if we know CCSU, the library's name for Henry Barnard. Henry Barnard was one of those new political party forming. It's called the Whigs. Henry Barnard was one of those Whig reformers. He comes up with an idea that we need a board of commissioners. He's actually in the legislature, and he annoys enough people that they appoint him as head of the board of commissioners. It's really the beginning of what we would call the State Board of Education. They give him the position hoping he'll shut up and go away and won't ask for any money because they don't want to give him any money, right? But one of the things Barnard is doing, along with a few others, is he's studying schools. He's traveling around and he's documenting the conditions in the schools. And he discovers that in some communities, the schoolhouses are barely standing. In some, there's holes in the walls and windows are broken and there's no real heat and they're not very well lit. So what Barnard and others are going to do at this time is they're going to come up with the idea that schools need to be well-financed. We need to invest in our children, right? How are we doing for time? Are we?
After 2.
It is? Okay. Like how much after 2?
About 5 or 10.
Huh?
10.
I'll talk faster. Okay.
Do you want to come back for one more session and take us to the next?
I think I'm going to have to. What I'll do next time is I'll just finish all of the PowerPoints I never finished. Okay. Let me go up. Okay. We'll finish on good old Noah, right? When I was doing this, I typed it. It was late at night. I typed Daniel Webster in, and then I went back and I looked at it. I thought, oh no, that's the other guy, right? All right. In 1685, we had printed what was called the New England Primer, and it was alphabet, prayers, and spelling. And the way you taught children the alphabet is A was for Adam, and it said, what is it? Well, Eve. Adam spanned, and so there were little Bible verses that went with each one, right? So early on, we did have books. We had the idea that children should be reading. In 1783, Noah Webster, he publishes what's called the American Speller. It's also known as the Blueback Speller. The Blueback Speller, I think it sold something like 78 million copies. It went west and covered wagons. There were kids in Oregon, in Arizona, and Texas, and all over the country learning from books that were 50 years old that their grandparents had used. So his American Speller. Webster was one of those people, he believed we needed a unique American culture. He believed that if we were going to have a country that was separate that from England, we needed to create a culture that was separate from England. The next 2 years, he's going to put out 2 more books. He puts out his grammar in 1784 and a reader in 1785. So it's these 3 books that become the basis for American public education for at least a century. And then in 1828, he published his American Dictionary of the English Language. He spent years and years and years, you can see, there's almost 40 years there. He studied Greek, he studied Latin, he studied Polish, he studied Russian, he studied French, I think all the Romance languages. I think by the time he was done, he could speak about 20 languages. And on his own, not using a team of researchers or computers, he came up with his dictionary, which is a remarkable work. And again, for him, this was truly needed to define the American culture. Right? And have we been to his house? Yeah, all right. Okay, well, we're done? All right, well, I forget how to get out of that. Do I click that? No, that's my, what, I'll just click out of it there. Okay. Once again, thank you. I have enjoyed this immensely.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.